So you might be asking yourself, what is linguistics? What is this topic we're diving into this semester? I'm going to use this lecture to give you a quick introduction basically to everything we're going to cover this semester. Now, this is a really quick introduction, but it's a basically opportunity to get your feet wet, get you thinking about some of these topics, and we will go into these topics a lot more slowly and more in depth as the weeks progress. But right now, let's just talk about what is linguistics, what is it we're diving into. So in linguistics, or in this class especially, our core areas that we're going to study are these components right here. We have phonology, orthography, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, sociolinguistics. We're not going to cover them in this order, but we are going to look into these basically branches of linguistics. Now I have this image right here of a head with words going in one ear and out the other. And that's because maybe to you, most of these terms don't make any sense. It might be a bit overwhelming because you haven't heard them before. One of the comments I get about this class is that we often introduce you to a lot of new terminology. I'm going to give you a tip right here. Every time you hear a term that you don't know or that we're introducing to you and we give you a quick definition, have somewhere that you're going to write it down because the terminology is typically the learning curve in this course. The concepts behind these core areas are actually not that complicated, but you're not familiar with the terms. Right now, it's going in one ear and out the other. I don't want you to be worried, though, if you're looking at some of those content pieces and thinking, I don't know what I'm getting into. Is this going to be hard? No, don't be worried. And here's why. You're not a blank slate. You are actually bringing in knowledge into this class already. I use the analogy of you may not know how to build a house, but you do know that it takes nails and wood. You may not know how a car engine works, but you do know that a car takes oil and gas to operate. You may not know linguistics from a science point of view, from an educated point of view, but you do know that something is wrong with this sentence. The grass green it was, right? As speakers of the English language, you actually can read that sentence and know something's wrong with it. You might not be able to tell me what's wrong with it, but you're not a blank slate because as a speaker of the language, you know that it's wrong. And in this class, when we get to syntax especially, we'll uncover why something like that is wrong. We're going to look at language and how it works. And you have a lot of information in your own head to bring into this class with you because you are a speaker of a language. And some of you might speak more than one language. So again, here are our core areas of linguistics that we are going to spend this semester covering. And we're going to do that by exploring one word. So there are over 170,000 words in the English language, and I can show you all those core areas I just introduced you to by looking at one word. And we're going to look at the word like. So if we were in class together, I'd ask you to create an example sentence using the word like. And then based on that sentence, write a definition for the word like based on how you used it in your sentence. So if you'd like to pause this film right now, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I'm going to show you what I typically get. Most students come up with one of these three things. I like hamburgers. I like her. Here, I usually get the definition of love or passion or like emotion for, right? I like hamburgers. I like her. Sometimes I get these other examples, though. It is shaped like a circle. It tastes like chocolate. So here, it's still the same word, like, but it has a whole different meaning. It doesn't mean passion or empathy or love, right? It is shaped love a circle. We couldn't replace, those aren't synonyms for this word, so it obviously has a different meaning. And in this case, the word like actually has the definition of equal to, right? And then sometimes I get this example. I got a like on Facebook. Okay, so to get a like on Facebook, that's not, maybe it's getting love on Facebook, right? But it's not getting similar or equal to on Facebook. So here we have like being an object. It's an imaginary object because it's a computer, but it's an object, right? I received like. I received a like. So it doesn't necessarily have the same definition as the prior two uses. So it's super interesting because already you're seeing with one word, I gave you one word, we have multiple different ways to use this word. But there's usually two that students don't think of. What about these occurrences? So we have like, she doesn't like dogs. And I'm specifically talking about the first like in that sentence. Like, she doesn't like dogs. So what is the meaning of that like? It doesn't mean love or passion for. It doesn't mean similar or equal to. It doesn't mean alike, like on Facebook. What is the use of that like? What's the meaning behind it? We actually call this a discourse marker because it's a filler, and I'll show you some more of those at the end of this lecture. What about the example on the right? She was like, I don't like dogs. Okay, again, we have another occurrence of this word where the definitions we've already explored don't fit and explain the use of like over here. In the case of the quotative like on the right, we could say, she said, I don't like dogs. She murmured, I don't like dogs. She was like, I don't like dogs. So we're seeing maybe what the meaning of like is there. I would usually ask my students, I would say, what's the difference between saying she said, I don't like dogs, and she was like, I don't like dogs? There's actually a difference between those two uses. So go ahead and think about it for a second, and I'll go ahead and tell you. Typically, when we say she said or he said, we're actually quoting the person, right? So she said she's not coming. Well, that's because someone literally said, I am not coming. If it was, she was like, I'm not coming, then that person didn't say explicitly they weren't coming. They maybe gave an attitude of they weren't coming. In this case, she was like, I don't like dogs. Perhaps the person didn't say they didn't like dogs, but merely they actually did something that gave the attitude of they don't like dogs. So we usually use the quotative like, they were like, she was like, when we're basically summarizing or paraphrasing an attitude or paraphrasing something someone said that was close to that. So there's a linguistic choice you're making in your head when you choose what you say. Because like can be used in all these different ways, we can look at a sentence like this. Now I'm going to hear myself say that word a lot, and it makes plenty of sense to you. She's like, I felt like I'd been kicked I felt like I'd been kicked by a horse-like creature and I didn't like it. Okay, so in your head, I'm guessing you never had to stop and think, well, what definition of like is this use? What definition of like is this? You actually are able to sort through your own lexicon and your own experience with the language what each occurrence of like means, what the speaker means by that. So you're not having to break down the definition of each word to make sense of this. So it's amazing. We can have one word that can have so many different definitions, and a speaker of that language is able to sort through that meaning and make a sentence like this make sense. So, welcome to linguistics. You've already started your journey. We have just looked at an area of linguistics called semantics, which has to do with the meaning of words. So with the word like, we just looked at how one word can have multiple meanings depending on how it's used and depending on what you as a speaker know about the language and can make sense of that use. So semantics has to do with the meaning of words, and that's what we just looked at when we looked at like and all its different meanings and the way we're using it. But we're going to continue our journey now. I want to look at pragmatics. And I know we're going out of order just because that made the most sense for this lecture. So we went from the meaning of words, which was semantics, so the literal meaning, to we're going to go into something called pragmatics, which has to do with underlying meaning. So let's take a look. Semantics, meaning of words. I like it. Well, like there means love or adore. Okay, that's what like means. But we can say the same sentence and have a different pragmatic meaning. So the pragmatics is not the meaning of the words, it's the meaning of the speaker. I can say I like it and that means I really do like it, or I can say I like it and I really don't like it. Okay, so now my meaning, even though semantically like means I adore it, as a speaker I can change that meaning and kind of communicate to you, I'm not really feeling it. So here's an example that I like to use to show that. Okay, so you've got two friends, they've both just recently gotten haircuts, and you don't want to hurt the guy's feelings on the left, but you also kind of want to communicate, well, I'm assuming most of you don't like the guy's haircut on the left, maybe some of you do, okay, but I'm just comparing this clean cut look to this other look, okay? So the COVID look, I guess. People need some haircuts right now. So do you like it? We might say to the guy on the right, I like it, right? He looks great. He cleaned up. We might say to the guy on the left, many of you might not like that haircut. You might say, I like it. I like it. Okay, you're changing the semantic meaning of the sentence because of how you're saying it and what you're actually trying to communicate. So pragmatics, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It is what the speaker really means when they said what they said. Okay, so that's obviously different than semantics, where we talked about the meaning of the words, the dictionary meaning of the word. And pragmatics, we're talking about what the speaker really meant by what they said. Let's move into sociolinguistics. We're still going to use the same word. Who uses like this way? They're like my best friend. So if we were in class together, this is usually a really quick summary. I know you're already thinking, who says this? They're like my best friend. Okay, I often have students point to me. Maybe I have a lot of the demographics of someone who might use that word that way. Remember, that's called a filler or that discourse marker. They're like my best friend. So I would ask age, and most of you would say younger people. I would ask gender, and most of you might say female. I would ask region. And now this word used to be a little more regional, meaning there was a specific place in the world we could associate it with. So typically the answer there might be the West Coast, California, but it's kind of spread, right? Pardon me, I don't know if you can see that. Let me close that real quick. I would ask race and ethnicity, and typically I would get Caucasian, right? Economic status. The typical response that I get there is maybe like the upper middle class or upper class white teenage girls, right? So this is called sociolinguistics. When we start exploring the way language is used by certain people. Okay, socio, think of it this way. Socio sounds like the word sociology. When we study the topic of sociology, we're studying about people groups, right? Whether that's race or age differences or gender differences or religious differences, that's all sociology. Sociolinguistics is when we look at all that stuff through language. And this is a super fun topic. It's actually the first one we're going to start with. So it's really awesome. But yeah, so here on the screen here, typically the responses I get, and that's okay because we know, you know as a speaker, that we make a lot of sociolinguistic observations about the language naturally. And they're not necessarily all educated observations, but we do know that language is connected to people groups. And that's going to be the topic we start with this semester. So sociolinguistics, influence of region and social roles on language. So region being where you live, or social roles being your gender or your age and stuff like that. So we'll get into it more. I want to jump to phonology now. We're going to move back to the top of the list. It's a little bit of a change of topic. The other three build up to each other. Phonology, though, has to do with sound. You probably heard the word phone, right? Well, cell phone, but phono, phone, phonemes, hooked on phonics. Those are all kind of in the same thing. It has to do with sound. It's pretty simple. So if we were in class, I would ask you, and go ahead and think about it at home, describe to me the sounds in the word like. Okay, don't look at the word. Just, I want you to tell me, describe to me all the sounds that make up the word like. Okay, it's not just one sound. Think about it. L, I, k. Okay, it's not just one sound. So you want to break the word down to its sound units and describe them to me. Well, most of you would say, well, the is represented by the L, the I is represented by the I, and the K is K-E. And you might think that is kind of weird. Why is K represented by two letters? Whatever, okay? But usually most people who don't know linguistics yet would want to describe sound to me using the English alphabet, especially, I mean, when we're talking about English, the English language. But that gets a little complicated because let's look at the word kick, okay? You just told me, my hypothetical student at home just said, okay, well, the I, lie, like, I, we're going to be doing a lot of that when we get into phonology. The I would be represented by the I in English. Okay, but what about kick? Because there's no I in kick. It's it. Okay, so we're having a problem here with the English letter I, that it's not actually representing one specific sound. So when we talk about sound and we're going into phonology, we're not talking about spelling. We're not talking about the English spelling system. We're moving away from what we can see visually, and we're just focusing on what we can hear, because words are made up of tiny bits of sound. And we have a special language in linguistics that we use to talk about sound, because you just saw with like and kick, we can't use the English alphabet. We need to use a different alphabet to talk strictly about sound. And in linguistics, we have the International Phonetic Alphabet. You can actually find the chart on your right on page 65 of our text. And you're going to get really familiar with this. So if you want to jump to that chapter at some point and just get familiar with this graph, I encourage you to do that. Print it out, have it by you. So the chart on the right is our International Phonetic Alphabet, and this one in particular describes all the sounds in the English language. English language, not the other ones. There are more symbols to help describe that, and we'll look at that later in a different lecture when we get there. But you can see on the right that in the first line on the left, we have the two brackets, and we have what looks like an English B. It's not the English alphabet though, okay? This is the International Phonetic Alphabet. I know it has some of the same Roman alphabet characteristics that we have in English. Just ignore that. When it's in a bracket though, we're talking about sound in that case. So the sound symbol looks like a B, right? But that represents in English the sound for B, 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 as in bed. We go to the next one, the sound symbol that looks kind of like a P, that represents the sound P, P, as in pick. So you can kind of move down that list and see D, as in dog, T, as in toy, F, as in fish, V, as in victory, K, as in kite, G, as in girl. And yeah, as you move through the chart, you'll notice, oh, some of the symbols get a little weird, okay? And that's okay. I'm introducing you to a whole different alphabet. Did I mention this is not the English alphabet, okay? This is International Phonetic. So we were in class together, but we would do this, and I want you to go ahead and try it at home. Looking at the sounds on the right, I just asked you, what sounds do you hear in the word like? Describe to me those sounds. And using the alphabet on the right, the International Phonetic Alphabet, I want you to try to identify what symbols over there we would use to describe the sounds we hear in like. Okay? So at home, if you want to pause this is what you do. You're going to pause it, write down two brackets, and inside of that, put all the symbols that represent sounds that you hear in L, I, K. Okay? So pause it and hit play when you're ready. Okay, so here are answers. Now, it's not easy. Maybe some of you got it, maybe most of you didn't. It's not easy. Granted, I just introduced you to this. You do not have to know this yet. We will use 2 weeks to go over this information. But if you had the chart in front of you and you're looking at what I have in front of you circled, that is the traditional, those are the traditional sounds or pronunciation, typical pronunciation for the word like. L, I, the A and the I looking symbols, they represent one diphthong sound, I, and then it ends with a K, okay? So this, phonetically, I can look at this phonetically and say like, like. I see the word, awesome. This next one, you see I've got a couple other things going on here. Like, there's another pronunciation for it depending on where you live, and a lot of young people are starting to do this. It's like, and they drop that k sound, and they basically do what we call a glottal stop, when you stop the sound in your throat. I'm not very good at it, but if you start listening to some of your friends talk, especially younger ones, you notice they don't say like, they might say like, and then drop the end sound. So what is this last sound I have here? What is this last combination? Because I just told you the one circled in blue is basically the standard pronunciation. Well, another really cool thing about sound is that we can use it to study study different pronunciations and accents between people learning a second language. Okay, so we've got on the left in the blue circle, like, that's how the traditional English speaker might pronounce it. On the right, though, we have how perhaps a Spanish speaker might pronounce the word given the sounds they have in Spanish. So imagine a very young Spanish speaker, young as in they're new to learning the English language. Okay, age doesn't matter. Let's say they're a young English learner. Okay, and they're entering the English language and they want to be able to pronounce the word like. Okay, so what they're going to do is keep in mind in Spanish has some sounds that are similar to English and some sounds that don't exist in English. And English has some sounds that don't exist in Spanish. We'll get into that more, but it's super fascinating. So a young English learner, speaker, maybe Spanish is the first language, might come across the word like and actually pronounce it as like. Okay, like. And we're going to go into more why that happens when we get into phonology, or orthography, which is our spelling. We'll get to that in a second. But we can actually use phonology, these symbols, to talk about sound differences and how accents occur and what kind of sounds in English somebody might struggle with because the same sound is not in their own language. So, for example, in the word like, I, okay, that sound is representing the letter I when we spell L-I-K-E. In Spanish, the letter I typically represents the sound E. So that's why we're going to get the like, right? So it's interesting. We'll get to it more. I find it fascinating, but that's why we need phonology. We need to be able to talk about sound differences and talk about them in writing because that can often be difficult. So we also, when we talk about phonology, there's one last thing I want to share. What is the difference, and we're still going to keep using our word like, okay? So what is the difference between I like him, I like him, I like him? What's the difference? Each of those sentences almost has a different meaning or a different implication because of stress. I like him, I like him, I like him, okay? And this type of sound also falls into phonology, why we stress certain words and how that kind of changes meaning. If I say, I like him, I'm clarifying who it is that likes him. It's me. It's not Susie. It's not James, whatever. It's me. I like him. If I say, I like him, I'm clarifying who I like, right? I don't like him, him. I like him. Okay, so stress like that, intonation is super important, communicating meaning, and that's also part of phonology. So phonology, basic definition is we're studying units of sound. We're studying sound, and it's a fun topic. Let's talk about orthography real quick. Orthography, how does sound and spelling correspond? Well, we just kind of looked at orthography when I showed you, when I asked you, describe the letters to me in the word, or how would you spell the sounds in the word like, right? And we found out we can't use the English alphabet. Well, when we're coming back to the spelling systems and talking about how we spell things, that's called orthography. So we want to look at how we spell something like the word like, L-I-K-E, but how it actually sounds. And so underneath of it, I have its phonetic spelling using that IPA chart we just saw. So some interesting things emerge when you look at language this way, and we'll, at this point, when we get to this section of our class, we'll spend a lot more time on reading. How does reading occur? Why is it challenging? What's exceptionally challenging about English too? So I broke down for you which letter matches with which sound. So you get the sound L that goes to the letter L. Get the sound I that goes to the letter I. And you get the sound K that goes to the letters K and E. Okay, so if you're any normal person, you're like, why does two letters represent one sound? That's so confusing. When is the E silent? Well, because you're speakers of the language, you know when it is, but how do we teach it? What else do we need to know about that? And then you look at a word like compared to kick, and you notice in kick also, we have that final K sound, but it's represented by a CK. Okay, so now you're introducing this reading to your students, and they come across K-E, and they might want to say K, right? Give it two sounds because there's two letters. Or they come across the CK, and you need to tell them, hey, that's one sound. For CK, you're only going to give it the K, just one sound, okay? So I'm using these two words just to demonstrate to you that it doesn't match. What we say and what we write don't always match. It's not always crystal clear. So we're going to investigate that. What's the reason behind it? And how do we treat it? How do you as an educator identify what might be tricky for a student? And how do you become informed? With orthography, we're also interested in spelling systems. So how has spelling changed over time? Believe it or not, on the left, that's how the word like used to be spelt. Used to spell it that way, and it's changed over time, and it's constantly happening. Okay, this isn't an old, I realize Gelic, G-E-L-I-C, is probably 500 plus years old. Okay, so that's an old example, but we're still doing this in English. We're still changing the spelling systems. So the word through to T-H-R-U, that's relatively new. Not like 6 months new, but it's new as in several years. Okay, so this is still happening. So now we looked at orthography, which is spelling and writing. Awesome. Let's move on to morphology. When morphology, we're asking ourselves, where does the word come from? So what's its history and how was it formed? Like, what's its word formation process? So with this word, we would look back at its history. A word, and we describe in English, we say, or in linguistics, we say etymology. So the history of a word is etymology. Well, we know this is a Germanic word. Okay, you don't have to know what that means right now. I'll tell you later. But it has gone from this spelling, this long spelling, to a more truncated spelling, G-E-L-I-C, to the modern spelling, L-I-K-E. And because it's a Germanic word, I know that we call this a native word. This word has been in our language for a very long time. But in morphology, we're looking not only the etymology of a word, but we want to look at how the word can form. Morph. Think of morph. You know what the word morph means? Something the shape changes. Okay, words can change too. So you look at these and you have the same root word, like, but I've added some things to it that let us use the word so many different ways. Liked, liker, liking, liken, likely, likable, likewise, likeness, and a really archaic liketh. But what's super interesting about this is you look at that last line, likety, likement, likery, likeful. Why don't those work? Why don't they work? Why can I take all these little pieces and add it to the word like in the first several examples, but I can't add those? There's some rules we're following. There's some reasons we can't do that, and we're going to explore that more in morphology. Okay, so morphology has to do with etymology and word formation. Let's go to our last category. Typically not everyone's favorite, and you'll see why. Called syntax. Okay, so recall the very first thing we looked at, which was semantics. I like hamburgers. I like her. So forth, so forth, so forth. And then we have like, she doesn't like dogs at the bottom. The one thing I want to draw your attention to here is look at where these words, the use of like, look at where they are in the sentence, okay? And this might not make a lot of sense, yes, but we have some rules depending on how we're using the word on where it can occur in the sentence and what it's allowed to be next to. So, for example, let's say, I like her. Like is a verb there. I got a like on Facebook. Well, you can't use the word a before the verb. I can't say, I like her, right? You can use it before a noun, though. So I got a like. So this is already telling me something about the syntax of the word, that it has some rules in terms of where it can occur based on how you're using it. So like is a super great example to demonstrate syntax because you might not know this yet, but I'm showing you right here. It can be used as so many different parts of speech. It can be used so many different ways. I like him. That's a verb. She is likable. That's an adjective. I'm likely coming. It's an adverb. Put it there like that. I got a like on Facebook. Like she went to the movies. Okay, so these are all different parts of speech. Some of you, this is ringing a bell, maybe for your elementary school days when you had to learn grammar and you didn't like it. I hope, just so you know, we're going to cover it in this class and we're going to take a fresh angle. You're really going to enjoy it. Another thing we would explore in syntax is not only where can a word be in a sentence, but what are the rules of it existing there? So we have these discourse markers. That's kind of a syntax topic. And I know that I can replace discourse markers. Well, typically they'll be at the beginning of the sentence, right? Short sentences. But I can replace it with like, so, well. These are all examples of discourse markers or fillers. Okay, something that typically doesn't exist in writing, but does in oral communication. But we also have the quotative like, which was, she was like, I don't like dogs. We could say, she said, I don't like dogs. She goes, I don't like dogs. She replied, I don't like dogs. There's something really interesting syntactically about using like as a quotative. And if you notice, it's because it has, you have to, well, let me simplify it. You have to use the word was to use the quotative like. I don't say she was said, she was goes, she was replied, but I say she was like in order to get that same semantic meaning. And this is something we call an auxiliary verb. Too much information, probably in one ear and out the other, but we're going to look into that stuff. These are all great things we're going to investigate together. Okay, so that was syntax. That had to do with word order. The order of which words can occur in a sentence and the rules that govern that. For some people, that's one of the hardest sections of this class because it's touching base on maybe some anxiety you had when you learned it in grade school, but it's a fresh focus on it and you're going to do a great job. And that's all. So with one word, the word like, I just gave you a quick rundown of everything we're going to look at in this class. And of course, we're going to spend a lot more time on each of those core areas and breaking those down. One last thing I wanted to mention about these core areas, is this order significant? So phonology to sociolinguistics, does that order mean anything? It really doesn't. And I went in a different order for this little introductory presentation. I started at semantics, remember? It doesn't matter. If you look in our book, though, you'll see that we're going to start with sociolinguistics. So that was one of the middle items we covered at the bottom on this page. And then we're going to jump to phonology, orthography, morphology. We're going to spend just a little time on syntax and pragmatics, not a ton, or semantics and pragmatics, and then we'll spend a lot more time on syntax. So that's a quick mock-up of this course, and if you have any questions, let me know. Bye, guys.